For centuries beyond counting, northeastern North America has been the Dawn Lands. Its people, the Wabanaki, are the people of the dawn. The Wabanaki now share their homeland with others who are also defenders of the dawn.
The truth is, I've lived in parts of rural Africa. I worked as a social worker, and in India I've been able to shower in my own home, everywhere I've lived.
I noticed at one point there's 5 policemen all around me. I'm by myself. I weigh 105 pounds, eh?
Particulate matter emissions from this mill are the highest in Canada, and it is a horrific problem here in this community.
When I got there, I could still smell the gunpowder. I could still smell the gunpowder, and all my friend was gone. And I thought everybody was dead.
It's not just our land. It's not just our water. It's sacred to everybody.
Hello, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. I've been covering environmental issues for more than 40 years, writing and broadcasting and podcasting about the damage we're doing to the air, the water, the forests, the oceans, about pesticides and oil spills, extinctions and global heating. It's depressing. People don't want to hear about it. I get that. But I can't leave it alone. I'm also a father, a grandfather, and a citizen, and I want a future for the people I love. A couple of years ago, I heard about environmental rights, the citizens' legal right to clean air and water, and also Mother Nature's legal right to be respected and protected. I thought, that's a tool I could use on any specific issue. There's just one problem. I'm a Canadian. Here's Dr. David Boyd, who literally wrote the book on environmental rights.
If you add up all of the countries in the world that have recognized the right to a healthy environment, you get 177 out of the 193 members of the United Nations, which is truly extraordinary. It means there are only 16 countries left in the world that have not yet recognized this fundamental human right.
Among the 16 nations whose citizens do not have environmental rights are North Korea, Oman, China, the United States, and Canada. Let me tell you the story of Melissa King and her husband. They thought the small bedroom community of Harrietsfield, just outside Halifax, would be an ideal place to buy a house and raise a family. It never occurred to them that their dream could sink in contaminated water.
Obviously, we weren't aware of the problem when we bought the house. We did test the water. The water test came back clear somehow, and the people who sold us the house did sign the water disclosure that there were no known problems with the water, and then they left the country.
But there were and are big problems with the water in Harrietsfield, Nova Scotia. This construction debris recycling site was established in 1997 over the protests of local residents. 6 years later, the Halifax Regional Municipality approved a landfill on the site, and the provincial government began monitoring the water in local wells.
What we would do is we would have strangers come into our homes and test our water, and we would get a 11-page, well, today we're getting an 11-page documentary with our water sample on it, and nobody can read or understand any of this.
Marlene taught herself to decipher and tabulate the results. 10 years ago, the reports started to show big increases in contaminants. The water stank, the community couldn't drink it, couldn't bathe in it, couldn't wash with it.
Well, I carry water jugs in my car, so I fill them up at work or friends' houses or family members. I don't shower in my home. I shower at my parents' house, and I've always bathed my child there as well. It's also polluted the lake, and a lot of people who used to fish there, the fish have all died.
In 2009, new research confirmed a growing plume of impacted groundwater flowing from the site. The residents demanded action, and the province ordered the company to clean up. The company appealed. 5 years later, in 2015, the appeal was dismissed. But any actual cleanup of the water is still years away. Meanwhile, Melissa King and her family were stuck with a house that couldn't even be sold.
We like this home, we like the neighborhood. We We wanted to stay, and I really couldn't figure out anything that would be safe for myself and for my child. So it was a hard decision, and I did a lot of research and thought about it for a long time, but we did in the end declare bankruptcy and walk from the house.
Contaminated water forced Melissa King's family into bankruptcy in a Canadian capital city just 15 minutes away from the Nova Scotia legislature.
I think there's this misconception that we live in Canada and we have this right to a healthy environment, to safe water, clean air, and the truth is we don't.
Walked everywhere they went and sailed on the wind. It wasn't even that long ago. Some still remember when you could drink the rivers and eat from every shore. Well, the tides come and go. They don't do that no more.
2 hours from Halifax, the northern pulp mill has, for half a century, spewed toxic effluent into the middle of the Pictou Landing First Nation. Oseg, Mi'kmaq for the other room, is a small estuary that provided the people with food, recreation, and shelter for boats. That's why Oseg became known as Boat Harbor in English. In 1967, the provincial government converted Oseg into a waste lagoon for the pulp mill. They promised Pictou Landing's people that they would still be able to use it for fishing and swimming. Well, this is Oseg today, a witch's brew of heavy metals and chemical wastes. Pictou Landing resident Jonathan Beater.
It's hurt a lot of people in the community, and I don't just say mentally, physically. You know, a lot of people's health has diminished over the years, just to long-term exposure. And so for a lot of us in our community, we felt, you know, that the fact that the issue of health was not being tended to, then we've kind of felt betrayed.
Oseg receives 77 million litres of effluent every single day. The effluent ultimately flows into the Northumberland Strait. The Sobey family's group of companies is headquartered in Pictou County. Paul Sobey lives 4 or 5 kilometers down the shore.
As a kid, I remember the whole area had a lot of sea urchins, and you go down Montgomery Beach or in front of our place just on Chance Harbor off the coast here, and it was all full of sand dollars. Well, they're all gone now. They finally admitted that there was dioxins and furans and cadmium and all these other heavy metals in Boat Harbor. So there's no doubt that that's also flowing out into the strait.
When we walked into Oseg, we heard not a single bird call, and only one on the way out. Governments have often promised that Oseg would be cleaned up. In early 2015, the present provincial government pledged it again. But here, as in Harrietsfield, the negotiations are going on between the company and the government, and sometimes the Pictou Landing First Nation. The individuals directly affected, like Jonathan Beadle and Paul Sobey, don't have a right to be heard, and nobody speaks for Oseg. Few people see Oseg tucked away on the east side of Pictou Harbor, but nothing can hide the reeking smog that regularly rolls across the harbor into the historic town of Pictou.
25 years ago, it was acceptable. And the old timers say, yes, the smell of money. Well, you know what? It's no longer the smell of money. It's the kiss of death, because there's so many medical concerns, and it's affecting the way people live their lives.
Anne Emmett owns a small inn in Pictou. What's the most important thing for people to understand about the town's air quality?
I think they need to understand the effect it is having on local business, not just tourism business, but any business at all. All you have to do is drive down the main street, and look at all the empty storefronts, the boarded up storefronts.
Dr. Jerry Farrell practices at the Aberdeen Hospital. He is also a passionate photographer, co-curator of a recent show called Clean Air, a Basic Right.
Environment Canada, on their website, last year said that of all the polluters in Canada, this pulp mill is number 5.
Matt Gunning, a Pictou businessman, heads up the 5,000-member Facebook page called Clean Up the Pictou County Pulp Mill.
In 2012, Northern Pulp admitted that they released 1,011 tons of particulate matter 2.5. The federal threshold for reporting is 0.3 tons. So we looked at that and said, well, that's a lot. And, you know, that's 336,900% over the reporting threshold.
Its design is you know, around 450 to 500 wet tons per day. They're producing up to 1,000. So it's double the capacity, and the plant's not designed for it. And you can see that through the effluent.
The precipitator that removes the particulates has been inoperative since 2006. It was supposed to be replaced in May 2015, but by midsummer the job was apparently incomplete. It's particularly galling that this company has received enormous amounts of money from the taxpayers.
When you hear them talking about putting $150 million in the mill, just remember where it really came from. So the mill, Northern Pulp, says we invested, and the we is the people of Nova Scotia who are doing the loans and grants, and it is a horrific problem here in this community. And what's different this time, I think it's more support from the broad-based community. And we're not allowing, whether it be the First Nations or the community at large, they're all talking the same thing. They're not allowing this divide and conquer.
But once again, the voices that count belong to government and industry. But what if everyone in the community had a right to clean air and water and a way to assert that right? When we come back, we'll go to Argentina and the Philippines, where people do have those rights. Buenos Aires, Argentina, is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. It's often called the Paris of South America. But for hundreds of years, Buenos Aires has had a dirty little secret. This river is the Riachuelo, and it forms the boundary between the city of Buenos Aires on this side and the province of Buenos Aires over there. The Matanza Riachuelo basin is 80 kilometers long, and it's home to nearly 5 million people. For more than 200 years, it has been horribly polluted, carrying the runoff from tanneries, oil refineries, chemical industries, shanty towns, and farmlands. As the new millennium began, its surface was matted with debris, and the river was littered with 53 abandoned ships, not to mention old cars, bathtubs, dead horses, and other stuff you don't want to know about. Then, in 2004, a little band of residents from an impoverished riverside neighborhood brought a lawsuit against the city, the province, the national government, 14 upstream municipalities, and 44 private companies, alleging that these organizations had damaged their health and infringed their right to a healthy environment. And the Supreme Court of Argentina agreed to hear what's become known as the Mendoza Case. The lead attorney in the Mendoza case was Daniel Salaberry, who was offended by the gap between what the country's environmental laws said and what actually happened. Mendoza was a huge case with innovations like public hearings and participation by civil society groups, and it worked.
The big problem in a country like Argentina is the effectiveness of law. The law can be declared in the Constitution, but if it is not properly practiced, it's dead letter.
On July 8, 2008, after 4 years of hearings and investigations, the Supreme Court handed down a landmark decision not just for Argentina, but for the world. In a judgment that one observer called sweeping and poetic, the court ruled that government and industry had indeed infringed the residents' right to a healthy environment and were obliged to repair the damage. A new multi-jurisdictional organization called ACUMAR was created to deal with the problem. ACUMAR's task was to remove the industrial pollution, clean up the landfills, provide potable water to the residents, install proper sewage systems and storm drainage, create an emergency health plan, move riverbank residents into proper social housing, and keep the public informed about its progress. The work would be supervised by a citizens group and by a judge to whom ACUMAR would make regular reports, with penalties to be imposed for delay. And that's what happened. Just one revealing fact. The Riachuelo is now monitored by 250 environmental inspectors. That's more inspectors than Environment Canada has for our entire country. Marina Aizan is a prominent Argentinian journalist who's written a book, Contaminados, on the Mendoza case. She discovered that the case ultimately was not about water.
I thought pollution was important, but as I went through the investigation, the research of my book, I realized that pollution wasn't that important. That the important part was the relationship of the people in the Riachuelo Basin, how the Riachuelo the pollution was a reflection of all the bad things about the economic, political, and environmental system. It wasn't so much about the quality of the water, it was about how people treated each other, and that was reflected in the water.
6 years after the Supreme Court's landmark decision, the Riachuelo is far from clean, but it's a long way from what it was. Landfills have been cleaned up, most of the junk is out of the river, 200 families have been moved into new social housing, and where their shanties once stood, a linear riverbank park planted with native trees is giving the river back to the city and its citizens. There's a lot left to do, and some tough questions remain unanswered. For example, the disposal of the toxic sediments at the river bottom. This is still a dirty urban river, but it gets a little cleaner every day. And as an example of what can be done, it has shifted the thinking of communities across this country and around the world. Meet Pablo Fajardo, a young Aboriginal lawyer from Ecuador, who sued mighty Chevron for polluting 1,700 square miles of the Amazon rainforest. He won a $9.5 billion judgment. Chevron fled Ecuador. So Fajardo's team sued in Toronto, trying to seize the assets of Chevron Canada to pay for that judgment in Ecuador. The Supreme Court of Canada heard the case in 2014, and by July 2015, it hadn't yet released its judgment. But how ironic is that? Ecuadorians suing for the enforcement of their environmental rights in a country that doesn't even recognize the environmental rights of its own citizens. Antonio Oposa Jr. in the Philippines has had a string of remarkable legal victories. Oposa says that he uses the law to tell stories.
The nice thing about the legal action are four things. One is that it tells a story. in a manner that is organized, orderly, logical, and backed up by evidence. Number two is that it brings the issue on the table of discussion. In a legal action, the person you would like to listen to your story will have to listen to that story. And number three, it spurs action. And number four, it may take 5 years, it may take 10 years, it may take forever, but there is going to be a resolution.
The case that made Oposa's reputation was a petition to the Supreme Court on behalf of future generations to ban logging in the country's vanishing old-growth forests.
He told the story of how there was only 800,000 hectares left of virgin forest in the Philippines. The government granted logging concessions to more than 4 million hectares, and we were cutting down at the rate of 120,000 hectares per year. And the story is the children who were the plaintiffs, the petitioners, in the next 5, 7, 8 years, they would not have any forest left. So the story is there. It's just that it became more significant when the Supreme Court understood what the story was all about and expanded the idea of this story. So it has been 5 presidents since, and the story lives on.
That case established the principle of intergenerational equity, the duty of the present generation to preserve a healthy environment for future generations. That's the Oposa doctrine, which is now recognized around the world.
The environment is not about the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees. It is about life and the sources of life, of land, air, and water. Easy to remember, LAW. If you don't have air for 3 minutes, we die. If we don't have water for 3 days, we die. If we don't have food for 30 days, we die.
Land, air, water, the law of life itself. And human laws must accord with that, otherwise we die. That's what the environmental rights movement is all about. When we come back, we'll meet the Maritimers who are fighting for environmental rights in our own region and winning. So now, if we want Canada to catch up with Ecuador, Argentina, and the Philippines, what do we do next? In New Brunswick, a unique alliance of parents, educators, health workers, and civil servants is trying to persuade their province to adopt a Bill of Rights to protect children's health from environmental hazards. Why just for children? Public health consultant Bonnie Hamilton-Bogart.
The thing, it's not only children. When we do it for the children, we end up creating a world that is fit for everyone. And so, but the children being the most vulnerable and the ones who are most sensitive to even very tiny, almost background amounts of certain chemicals and elements, particulate matter in the air. Our bill is essentially based on the notion of child honoring, because that is a kind of an ethic that if it were adopted by governments or if it were adopted by an NGO, it would govern or it would guide everything that they do. And it would, in a way, it combines the ethic of respecting the child's development with respecting the earth.
Inverness County, Nova Scotia, population 19,000, has boldly embedded environmental rights in its laws already. The process started in 2010.
This is Lake Ainslie is behind me. It is Nova Scotia's largest natural freshwater lake. And in this field here is where Pictou Resources planned on drilling for oil. When I first heard about it, to tell you the truth, I thought, great, there's going to be jobs in the area. And then it was actually my husband started looking into exactly what was involved, and that's when we found out about fracking.
It turns out that whatever oil and gas lies beneath Lake Ainslie can only be recovered by hydraulic fracturing, or fracking. We're going to be talking a lot about fracking, but briefly it involves drilling a well into shale far below the surface and then injecting a high-pressure cocktail of water, sand, diesel oil, and various unspecified chemicals. The exact mix is considered confidential proprietary information. The fluid shatters the shale and releases little pockets of gas and oil encapsulated in the rock. Will methane escape? Will the fluid pollute the groundwater? Does fracking cause earthquakes? The debate is fierce.
We contacted the First Nations in Waikoma, and we got a lot of support.
She met Seven Bernard and his niece Madonna.
Rebecca's like my sister now, we're like best friends.
It actually brings tears to my eyes when I think of the support that we got from our First Nations. We really are missing out on one of the best resources we have in this country, and that is the Indigenous people and their connection to this land.
It's not just our land, it's not just our water. It's sacred to everybody, and if we lose our water, there's no turning back. There's no way in getting it back, you know what I mean? Same with the animals. If we lose the animals, there's no way getting them back. The land, the environment, everything is connected.
The Anti-Fracking Alliance held demonstrations and information sessions at the Canso Causeway and the provincial legislature. By February 2011, the opposition was strong enough for Cora Lee Cameron of the local Council of Canadians to ask the Inverness County Council to pass a resolution calling for a ban on fracking in Nova Scotia.
We presented our concerns about it and what we really wanted for the county, which was more sustainable industries and things that were already happening to be supported. And it was interesting at council that day to see how full the chamber was and to see the mix of neighbors and residents who were there to support the presentation. It surprisingly went well because they voted in favor of the resolution.
Pictou proposed partners withdrew, discouraged particularly by the vigorous opposition from the First Nations. Meanwhile, the Anti-Fracking Alliance was proposing an actual bylaw banning fracking in the county. Johanna Pedelt of the Council of Canadians remembers a down-home policy development meeting with County Warden Duart McCauley and others.
We just had a conversation, all of us together. And at the end of that conversation, Duart said, well, we'd like to have investigate the possibility of a bylaw. Council, we don't have the resources, the knowledge to do this. Do it and come back and give it to us and present it to us, and we'll take a look at it.
So the citizens probed and researched and eventually drafted a unique bylaw carefully rooted in the Supreme Court's rulings on the Charter of Rights and the precautionary principle.
Land use is the province has jurisdiction over land use. They don't have, jurisdiction over human rights issues. And as well, the idea of the precautionary principle, that if something can be foreseen to do harm, then one has a right to be protected from that. And so that put the whole bylaw on a different kind of legal ground.
In May 2013, the County Council passed Bylaw 45, forbidding fracking within its jurisdiction as a matter of human rights, particularly a fundamental right to pure water. 2 months later, Pictou drilling lease expired, and Pictou was essentially bankrupt. Municipal Councillor Jim Mustard points out that even a small municipality has one huge resource: the skills, energy, and dedication of its own citizens.
I think municipalities have to be taken on as a better organizing body. We don't have the expertise with our 6 municipal staff, elected officials and small staff, but we can convene the expertise, and in bringing that together, you don't think we could have better conversations? I do think.
A great community achievement. It's a treat to see the democratic process alive and well and living in Cape Breton Island. And that summer, having drubbed fracking at home, Seven Bernard, Madonna Bernard, and Rebecca Parkins, and many others, traveled to Elsipogtog, New Brunswick, to participate in the still larger anti-fracking protests there.
If you would have told me 7 years ago when I moved to this province that I would have been in New Brunswick, standing side by side with our First Nations, protesting, I would have said you're crazy. But I have completely changed the way I look at things, and that is through the education that I got through the First Nations.
And it's that astonishing movement in New Brunswick that we'll visit when we come back.
Tell me what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like! Tell me what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like! Tell me what
In 2013, around Elsipogtog, New Brunswick, an apparently irresistible force met a genuinely immovable object. The force was the combined will of industry, government, and the police. The immovable object was a defiant alliance of Indigenous people with French and English settlers. And here again, the issue was fracking. The provincial government of David Alward granted a 2.5 million acre natural gas lease to SWN Resources Canada, or SWN. SWN was a subsidiary of a Texas oil company.
What we got as a consultation was basically, it wasn't consultation, it was verbal abuse. SWN arrived in our little community here and told us that the government had essentially given them our land, that they could come on our land and put gas wells there or whatever they wanted, and the only choice we had in the matter was whether or not we would take the pittance that they were going to offer us for the surface rights. And so here you were, this lovely, perfectly charming man is coming in, well, it's our land now, and we'll do what we want with it. And we got left there, picked up our pickets and said, oh no, you won't either.
SWN was targeting my house directly. Their map for the exploration went right in front of my house. So they were literally after my own water. So besides all of the other things, the fact that I am a human and ecosystem rights activist, Aboriginal person, woman who walks a traditional pathway, I'm also the homeowner whose property is threatened.
Would happen every time we met, the thumper trucks came out. People would go, they would stand in the highway. The first time we went out, there were more than 300 people. And eventually the police said, if you don't get off the highway, you will be arrested. And people then decided whether or not they were going to be arrested that day.
Not only was this a very complex alliance, but it was an alliance that had sought out a lot of different attempts to avoid conflict rather than engage in conflict, and I don't think that's what was being reported.
The first time we saw this phalanx of cops arrive, we started to laugh because it was little old ladies like me, mostly elderly, because who else is out in the middle of the day? Most people work. So, I mean, when we saw this sort of mass of officers, we thought, well, these people have lost their minds. It's like...
I noticed at one point there's 5 policemen all around me. I'm by myself. I weigh 105 pounds, eh? I was carrying a drum, I was praying. It only struck me at that moment, they were about to arrest me. I had no idea.
Then came Aboriginal Day, June 21st.
That day they decided that they were only arresting First Nations people. And they literally dragged white people off the road so they wouldn't have to arrest them. When that happened, I thought, my gosh, this You know, the laws of Canada don't apply here.
And there's one old lady does the same thing. Goes in front of the thumper trucks and sits down, and next thing you know, they grab her and then, bam, they punch her. Whoa, okay, that was it. There was this one RCMP in front of me. I just threw him away, and I ran over there, and there was these RCMPs that were still fighting with her, and I flipped.
Jason Augustine was the first Mi'kmaq warrior to be arrested. But the fight intensified. Supported by the RCMP and the Alward government, SWIN pushed forward with its testing and the community pushed back. In late June, a SWIN drilling truck went up in flames. At the end of July, a convoy of thumper trucks emerging from the woods was ambushed and blocked by protesters.
And then we all stood in a line and we all started singing and we all just stood there and all of a sudden I just said, I'm going to have to do something. So they just helped me. I got up, walked towards the truck, climbed up, and they pushed me up. And they just passed me the chains and the padlock, and I just ended up tying myself to the truck.
The united front of natives, Acadians, and Anglophones faced down the police, went to jail, dove in front of trucks. They had one clear message: you will frack in New Brunswick literally over our dead bodies. Did they have an alternative?
I would say no, personally. I think that most of New Brunswick that was choosing to be, at those protests had been painted absolutely into a corner by a non-responsive provincial government and a non-responsive Indian Act government as well. So the recourse towards, the democratic recourse, the pleas to government, those were falling on deaf ears.
On October 17th, hundreds of Mounties surrounded a sleeping encampment of protesters who were blocking a convoy of SWIN trucks. The Mounties had dogs, snipers, aircraft, and riot gear. Their guns were drawn. When the smoke cleared, literally, the trucks were gone, the jails were full, and several police cruisers were on fire. Romeo Martin, who had